Go ahead.
Hey everybody, I am so glad to be with you today. This is my good friend, Dr. Heather Huszti. She is the Chief Psychologist at CHOC Children's Hospital in Orange, California. And today is National Children's Mental Health Day in this month on emphasis on mental health. And so we're going to talk a little bit about kids and mental health. You may see a few festive signs behind us or posters, and that's because, don't get confused, this is still just May 4th. But they needed to celebrate today because they're going to be off, and so you're not confused if you see Cinco de Mayo stuff. It's really still just May 4th. But anyway, so Dr. Huszti, just tell us a little bit about the state of mental health, mental illness for children in the United States. How real is it? Is it really real?
You know, and I think that's a question like we get asked all the time is, I think people think about childhood as being such a carefree time, right? It's like, what do kids have to be depressed or upset about? Because, you know, we now know as adults, we're like, look at all the big stuff that happens. But kids actually experience mental health problems at the same rate as adults. So 1 in 5 children in the U.S. has a diagnosable mental health problem during their childhood, which is astonishing, right?
It is.
And it can really be in kids as young as 3, 4, 5 years old. And I think a lot of people just aren't prepared for that and sometimes don't recognize those signs and symptoms early on as being a mental health.
As being a mental health issue. You and I were talking before we started that that's really our story in a nutshell. Matthew, we knew from the time he was small, toddler, that he was different than his older brother and sister. But we just thought it was his unique personality. We knew there were difficulties, we knew there were hard things about him, but it just never occurred to us that those differences and those struggles were related to mental illness. I didn't even know children could have a mental illness. Like you said, it could start as early as age 3. I had no clue. So when Matthew was 7, we had moved from one part of the city to the other, and he became very sad. And I just attributed that, his dad and I did, to the fact that we'd moved and he'd left, the children that he was living next to. But it just kept going, and he stopped wanting to play, and he'd come home every day from school, and he didn't want to play with his toys, and he didn't want to play with his friends, and he kept just saying he was sad. And when I would ask him why he was sad, he couldn't even answer that. So again, I just kept thinking, well, this is just because we've moved, and he'll get over it. So talk to me a little bit about how can parents know that what's going on in their child isn't normal, that it's not just normal childhood stuff, that there's something else.
Well, I think with children it is hard, right? Because children have a limited way of expressing themselves and their cognitive capabilities. It's not like an adult where you can go like, well, I'm sad because this happened and I'm stressed, and kids just can't process that, right? So that sense of him just saying, I don't know, I'm just sad, is very typical in kids. And they have a very limited range of ways they can tell you they're upset. So I have a tantrum. Well, what does that mean? I have a tantrum because I want a chocolate bar? I have a tantrum because there's a mental illness going on. And so I think the thing that we really try and look at is pervasiveness. Like, does it happen more often than not? So is that pretty typical, and does it happen across settings? So if it only happens at home when dad's watching them, that's probably behavioral, right? If it's across the board, it happens at preschool, it happens at home, then you're going to want to start thinking,
paying attention to that.
Maybe there's something else going on there. And I think the other piece for kids in particular is what you kind of described there, of that sense of all those things I used to like to do just don't engage me anymore. That is a key sign of depression. We call it, big fancy word, anhedonia, but it's a key marker of that. And for kids in particular, when I don't want to play video games, I don't want to hang out with my friends, that's also something.
Or aren't changes in eating and sleep also.
Those are the other things we look in. So both an increase in eating as well as a decrease, and same with sleep, both sleeping more or sleeping less. So we really talk to parents about, has there been a change in those kind of patterns? And also fatigue. So if they're sort of like, oh, I'm just so tired, I can hardly engage, those would be another thing.
Is it about the same, are those same characteristics or same symptoms for adolescents? So even not just the youngest children, but also how does it look different in
Yeah.
adolescence?
It looks much the same. I'll tell you one thing about adolescence that we're really look at is irritability can sometimes substitute for depression.
Okay.
And again, a lot of adolescents are irritable at
Absolutely.
certain times, right?
Yeah.
But again, if it's sort of pervasive, and I kind of talk to adolescents about, you just feel like you kind of want to just pinch people's heads off, like you're just, so irritable.
Right.
And so just to kind of give them that flavor. So I think sometimes parents are confused because that seems so adolescent-like.
Right.
That
you
how
would
could that be
expect-
depression?
Yeah, how could that
Yeah.
be depression?
Yeah.
Um,
But it's that coupled with the sleep changes, the eating changes. With
I think that's really important what
Yeah.
you said for parents to be able to know that it's across the board.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that it's not just in one setting.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think parents who are watching this, so there will be some who'll be terrified
Yeah.
that their child has a mental illness
Right.
when they don't.
Right.
But they need these kind of these markers to be able to
Yeah.
say, okay, does it happen here? Does it happen
Yeah.
here? Is there a whole cascade of things that are
Right.
happening with
Right.
them,
Right.
as opposed to one thing once
Right.
every once in a
Right.
while?
It's not like I missed a meal
Right.
or I had a bad night. It is more often than not is what we talk about. So more days than not, more often than not, throughout the day,
Okay.
they're having that, and that you don't see that bounce back. With
Oh,
kids,
that's good too.
where they're sort of like, okay, I'm down. Someone yelled at me. My friend doesn't like me anymore. I'm really down. And then an hour or two later, like, let's play with the dog.
Sure.
And so with kids who we're a little more worried about, they wouldn't have those bounce back times, right?
What about kids though who maybe have bipolar and maybe they do have some of that? So
Yeah.
then how does a parent distinguish maybe their child? Because kids who have bipolar disorder
Yeah.
typically aren't just depressed. They
Yeah.
also have a what we call a manic
Yeah.
or a higher energy side.
Yeah.
So how does a parent know? How do they know that bounce isn't also part of an illness?
And that's a great question. I think one of the things about bipolar is often it's an energy that's coupled with an irritability or anger,
Okay.
not necessarily just, hey, I'm super happy.
Okay, that's good.
And it would be coupled also with like real changes in sleep. So like you're sleeping an hour or two and going, I am fully energized.
Okay.
So there's other constellations that go around that too. So
That's helpful.
Yeah.
That's helpful because again, it's not just it's outside of the range really
Exactly.
of normal behavior.
Exactly.
So let's just say you notice these things, you notice them over time, and you think that maybe your child there is something wrong. What
Yeah.
what do you do? What does
Yeah.
a parent do? Where do
Yeah.
you go?
Yeah, it's a great question because I do think sometimes it's just like I don't know. I think a lot of times parents do go to their pediatrician, who sometimes can provide that guidance on that normal development. But I think sometimes for pediatricians too, it's hard to make that distinction because I'm only seeing you in my office for a brief period of time. So sometimes it's reasonable to say, hey, I'm having some concerns. Let's watch it for a little bit. But then maybe we need to move on. So I think a couple of the things we think about is there's probably sometimes some basic kinds of things you can do and just see, does that kind of, so I set some more firm boundaries. I get things a little more predictable for kids. I make sure I'm helping you deal with stress a little bit better. And if those things don't change it, and I think this is where parents start to go, oh, am I the cause of it?
Yeah.
And I always want to be
Yeah.
very clear, no, parents are not the cause of it.
Yes.
But we know that for some kids, those things can help bring the symptoms back into a normal range. For others, it doesn't because there's probably some other process going on. And then it's reasonable to say, let me get an evaluation by a mental health provider.
Okay.
A couple of things I would caution our viewers about is you want to get a mental health provider who has experience in kids. Sometimes you'll get people who will go like, well, I'm comfortable with kids. And it's like, yeah.
That's
you
not
really-
the same as
it's not the-
competent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you want to have someone who most of what they do is with
Okay.
kids and families, because it is hard, particularly with the younger ones, to know what those patterns are
That makes
because it's difficult to tease apart sometimes. Yeah.
So let's just say your child has maybe been given a diagnosis of
Yeah.
anxiety or depression or ADHD or bipolar, early onset bipolar, or even schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Even with
Yeah.
so let's just say your child has been given
Yeah.
a diagnosis. How do you help a child on a day-to-day basis
Yeah.
to cope and to manage a mental illness when they're already childhood in itself is
I
challenging.
know, it's so hard.
What you mentioned a few things, but how can parents help their kids?
Well, it's a great question, and I think one of the things is sometimes, and it's kind of a way we try and help parents is sometimes some of those great parenting strategies that parents know don't work so well for kids who are struggling with mental health problems. So we kind of teach you some new techniques, which again does not mean that those standard parenting techniques caused anything.
Right.
It just means you need to manage it differently, right? Yeah. So more structure is usually very helpful. It's usually very helpful to give kids cues of, in 5 minutes we're going to move on to this, so that kids learn how to transition.
Yeah.
I think it can be really helpful to talk with kids about, oh, so, this is a really tough moment. What are some things you can do so that we keep, instead of we tell them what to do, we guide them. Exactly.
Solutions for themselves.
And put names on things like, oh, you're crying. That makes me think maybe you're sad. Are you sad? And so you're starting to label.
Are you a big believer in feeling words lists?
I am, just to help kids start to distinguish what's happening internally.
And by that I mean, just in case, I shouldn't assume.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that sometimes I've seen that people will do lists of different emotions. Because, as you said, kids don't necessarily know how, they don't have the cognitive skills yet to identify what they're feeling. And so to have feelings, words lists that you can even fill in the gap, or you teach them meanings of words, so that when you say, what are you feeling, are you feeling this, they know what that word means.
And in fact, there are even
some of the pluses and minuses of that if it's not that.
Absolutely. And there are even some apps that help kids with that, of like, here's some kids fighting with each other, and then you're kind of like, what emotion might they feel? Oh, maybe they're angry, maybe they're sad, and you can talk it through. So I'm a little bit more, not just like a list of words, but more a, how might that make that kid feel, or how might you feel? Gosh, some people might feel sad when blah, blah, blah. So you're kind of helping them.
Building empathy?
Yeah, building empathy, building markers and cues. Like, oh, when your stomach feels all like butterflies are in it, sometimes that means you're worried. And so we start to put words to that. There are things like, and things that we do in therapy, like there's a game called Feelings Bingo, where you kind of match faces up together and start to learn the words
so to identify from somebody's face what feeling might that picture represent, what emotion.
Exactly. So I think those things can be helpful. I think another thing that can be helpful is to really, it's not take stress away, but minimize the number of things coming into a child that they have to process. So for instance, a lot of times we'll say to kids, okay, go take your hat, hang it up, run upstairs, grab this, come back. And, right?
They've lost it.
And they've lost it. Exactly. They're like, what?
Yeah.
And for kids who are struggling a little bit, it can feel overwhelming. And so to more sort of, let's slow it down, let's go one step at a time, so that they feel like I've got some success.
Sure.
So some things like that. Yeah.
Good things.
Yeah.
So what about a child who, unfortunately, children experience horrific trauma sometimes. Sometimes it can range from, maybe their parents split up, their parents divorce, or they split up, or they move, or maybe there's some abuse in the home, physical, emotional, sexual, neglect. I mean, there's all sorts of things that happen to children. We, like you said, we wish childhood was just, rainbows and unicorns, but it isn't. And some kids go through some horrific things. So for children who've experienced trauma, how can parents help, and what do we need to do for those kids? And how does that affect their mental development?
I mean, those are all great questions. One of the things the research is really showing pretty strongly now is the relationship with what we call ACEs, so the adverse childhood events, that really has lifelong effects on health, that they have poor physical health, and certainly on mental health, certainly on an increase in substance use. So you're absolutely right. Like, if we can get in there early and address those issues. So I think sometimes people feel like, oh, the trauma's over, let's not talk about it or think about it, because that'll make people feel better. It really should be the opposite. We really need to process it and work through it. And that's...
So what do you do when a child says, I don't want to talk about it? Or I don't, maybe a little bit older child who has experienced trauma.
So they never want to talk about it. That's a rule of thumb. But I will tell you how children process things is through play. So I'll just give you an example. A friend of mine, years ago, there was baby Jessica that got stuck in the well. You guys remember? And
I do, because I'm old.
Well, I'm right here with you. Maybe the viewers won't remember, but
it was a little girl
fell into
a well, and she was stuck in the well
for like 27 hours or something.
And so she had to be rescued from this. So that's the
they dug down and got her. And so my friend's daughter was living in the town where that happened, and I saw her it must have even been 6 months later, and she was doing this weird play with her My Little Pony. A My Little Pony like fell down, and there was all sorts of stuff surrounding it, and she went through it a couple of times with me before I went, it's baby Jessica. She's processing the whole trauma that had happened with this child, and she was working through it. So one of the things we know as therapists is it's not such a good idea to go, how are you feeling about that trauma? But more like, hey, let's draw a picture, because they'll draw it over and over again. Or here's some dolls. Let's play with those dolls, because they will play out what the situation is over and over again until you, dumb adult, get it.
Well, so let's just hope that in most situations, children who've been traumatized get the professional help that they need as parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles, people who love children. Is that something that pay attention to?
I would.
How children play and what are the themes that they come back to?
Absolutely.
Maybe if you don't know something has traumatized your child.
It is, and that sometimes can be, if it's over and over again. So again, I don't want parents to be like, oh my God, they did this once.
Yeah.
But if you, again, persistently see something, sometimes that's a clue. And sometimes as parents and people who love children, you can actually give them a mastery experience of like, oh, so the horse fell down. What's the horse going to do? And then you can kind of build let's build a little bridge. The horse can get up.
So that they see rescue.
They see rescue and help.
Oh,
and they have mastery in I've done something. And you play that out over and over again. But that can be helpful. From fairly young age, more school age-ish, there is an evidence-based treatment called trauma-focused CBT, which helps kids sort of go through it. Oh, I'm sorry, cognitive behavioral therapy. Use those little acronyms.
I'll try to help you.
That's good. Thank you. Guide me through that. One of the things, parents are involved in that. You help kids sort of move through the trauma, come up with some growth from that trauma, and then present to the parents. So parents can help by also listening, being available to kids, not sort of going like, don't talk about that, that's too scary, but really kind of sitting with that. And then there's also the helping kids as they start to maybe get upset to go, what do we do when we get upset? We can calm our body by taking some breaths. So you can help build in some of those coping strategies. And we find that really helps kids because kids are so resilient innately.
Well, actually, you just for our time, I'm going to skip a couple of these. We'll have to do another one. But that is actually one of the two things I would ask you as we kind of maybe wrap this up is, one, what would you say briefly to a parent who's raising a child with mental illness? Is there hope? I mean, really, that's at the end of the day, parents want to know, but is there hope? Yeah. Is there hope for my child? Yeah. Is it always going to be this hard for them? And then secondly, if you would just maybe wrap up when you kind of answer that is, what does it take to raise a resilient child? Give us a few tips about raising a child who is resilient to the hard knocks that life brings to us.
Absolutely. So this is always, you never want to get a psychologist talking because
well, there's just
there's so much. Exactly.
Right.
So I think there absolutely is hope. And the thing I really want to say, and the important thing of why I know it's scary and heart-wrenching when you think, what's going on with my kid?
I'll
look to them. It's scary and heart-wrenching. But here's the thing, is kids' brains are so resilient that we really believe if we can get in there early, that we can change the trajectory in a way that you can't do once you grow into adulthood. And I really firmly believe that we can change the trajectory, sorry, big word there, trajectory of adult mental health by really focusing on children's mental health. So I've got to say to you, there is a lot of hope, and the sooner you get out there and do something, the better it's going to be. So please know there's a lot of hope. No matter what it is, it can be much better. So that's number one. I think number two on resilience, again, because kids are innately resilient, there's a lot of things you can do. One of those is really teaching kids about feelings, teaching kids about those kinds of coping things, about, hey, deep breathing. And like for little kids, you can have them lay on the bed, put a little stuffed animal on their belly, and say, make the stuffed animal rise and fall, because they like that kind of game. But it teaches them how to do those deep cleansing breaths, right?
Because when we're under stress, we tend to breathe.
We
really
breathe up
shallow.
and we breathe up here, right? But when we breathe down here and deep, we actually set off chemical messages in our body that go, slow down, everything's going to be okay. Kids very young can learn to meditate better than we can, in little small bursts. So you can teach them those. So those kind of coping strategies, yoga is a great thing. But also basic good health. Teaching kids, because if you start this habit as a kid, go out and play. Like, let's not sit in front of the screen. I hate to say that, we're on Facebook, but shut the Facebook, go outside.
After they finish.
After we finish this, and run around and engage, right, in that physical activity. Good eating habits, good sleeping habits. If we start those foundationally, we know that that's going to make a more resilient child.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Heather. You're Dr. Huszti professionally, but Heather is my friend. Thank you for joining us. But I would, just as we wrap up, I would just reiterate what Heather said. There is hope. If you have a child that has a mental illness, as she said, the sooner that they get help, the sooner that you figure out how to treat them, what it is, treatment they might need. If you work on these things, like she said, exercise and sleeping well and eating well and movement and all those things. And then being open, don't be frightened. There's a stigma around mental illness, and it can be frightening to think your child might have a mental illness, because what we do is we go to the worst case scenarios. And there are so many children who do well when they are diagnosed early and they get the help that they need. There's always hope. We're so glad that you joined us today on National Children's Mental Health Day.